Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm returning to the topic of decision making and looking at an alternative way of thinking about it, and in particular, how perception influences the way that we make decisions. In previous shows, I've explored the reasons why we're not always as good at decision making as we should be, and what we can do to improve. You can find links to my discussions with Dr. Melina Moleskis and Ben Cattaneo in the show notes. This time, I'm exploring whether we can understand it better, look at it in a slightly different way. This is where my guest Elspeth Kirkman comes in. She's a behavioural scientist whose recently published book Decisionscapes brings an artistic lens to the subject. What if the way we make decisions was akin to the way an artist looks at the world before choosing what to draw? Just as they decide what aspects of what they can see before them to include in their picture and how they want to present it, might we also be selective about how we view and interpret the information we have as we're making decisions? As you'll hear, it's a fascinating metaphor that highlights how decision-making is individual. What matters to you when making a decision might not be the same things that matter to me, so we can easily make different decisions based on the same inputs. But equally, the way I see things might be different from the way you see them, or we might not be looking at the same information or have had the same experiences when we start to take decisions. In other words, the decisionscape you have is not the same as the decisionscape I have. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. I find this approach fascinating, and I really enjoyed reading Elspeth's book, which is why I was thrilled when she decided to join me on the show. I think this is a fascinating contribution to the way we can think about decision-making and therefore human risk. So please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Elspeth Kirkman on Decisionscapes. Elspeth, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am delighted to have you here because, as I was saying to you before we started recording, I love the sense of humour and the energy that you bring to your social media content. And it's always behavioural in nature. But to help my listeners understand the context of some of the things you've written, can you tell them a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I think probably the main thing people need to know if they're interested in picking up this book is that I think my superpower is going off on a tangent and finding connections between things that are not obviously connected. So perhaps that's why the slightly chaotic nature of my social media emerges. So I'm Elspeth. I'm a behavioural scientist by background. So I worked at the behavioural insights team for about 10 years. My current job is that I work at Nesta, which is an innovation charity in the UK. And I'm their chief programs officer. So that means I oversee the bulk of their programmatic work. And that work is mixed methods. So it brings together a bunch of different disciplines, behavioural science being one of them, data science, design, experimentation, arts and culture, all sorts of amazing and interesting ways to look at the world, understand it and make it different. And we apply those to three big kind of social challenges. So one is around healthy life expectancy, one is around sustainability, and one is around early years and childhood development.
Wow. Love that. That fascinating work. And some of that comes through into the book, which gives us a neat jumping off point into that. What prompted you to write this? Because once I'd read it, I thought, well, there's so many different, almost to your point around your social media feed, there were so many inputs. You've got personal stories in there. You've done some, what was the sort of start point you think I'm going to write a book about making decisions?
Yeah, well, it's quite a long time in the making. So I remember having my first sort of serious is not quite the right word, but my first lengthy conversation about it in 2015. And I was in a pub with my friend, Kate Glazebrook, who's a wonderful person and a great thought partner for these kinds of things. And she kind of got really enthusiastic about the original kernel of the idea. The kernel of the idea was quite different to what's in the book. It was about decisions related to a sort of physics equation. So if you think about trying to open a door, it's much easier to open the door if you pull from the handle than it is if you push or pull from near the hinge. And I kind of observed that in decision making quite a lot. So people that were on the front line really close to a problem would find it often much harder to make decisions because everything was so heavy and it felt very difficult. Whereas you would get people who sit in Whitehall, for example, in the civil service, who it's very easy to make decisions that have very large consequences. So things like you change the formula in a spreadsheet as to how a benefit is distributed. And that has massive ripple effects across the whole country. And that feels very, very easy relative to to the sort of frontline version of the decision. Anyway, it wasn't, as you can tell, the most streamlined idea, but it was kind of an interesting starting point. And some of the things in the book were in my mind when we had that initial conversation. And then it sort of rested for a bit, but it must have been just marinating in my head, I suppose. And in 2021, I was about to go on maternity leave and basically panicked and thought, what am I going to do on maternity leave? Turns out look after a baby. I think it's quite a big job. But I pitched it to my publisher and they went, yeah, okay, it doesn't sound like the best decision, but all right, write a book on decision making. And so that's what I did.
Love that idea. Well, I'm going to have some time on my hands, so I might have to do so. But I'm delighted that you managed to find the time to write the book, and you've called it Decisionscape. So the obvious question is, what is a decisionscape?
Yeah, so the decisionscape, the idea is that you can think of your decisions in the way that an artist might think about their canvas or the thing, whatever it is they're gonna draw. And so the decisionscape is basically this mental representation of all of the factors that play into your decisions and how they're arranged and which things loom largest and whether you're kind of, using perspective correctly. So if something's kind of in the distant future, maybe you've minimized it so much that it's completely behind the horizon line of your picture at this point, and it shouldn't be. It should be something that you can still see, but maybe you weight a little bit differently. So yeah, the idea of the decisionscape is that if we thought a little bit more like artists do, we were very deliberate about what we do and don't include, what we put weight on, where we draw attention, then we might make decisions differently and better.
When often we think about decisions, it's data, and people talk about it sort of data-driven decision, but we know that there's a lot of comedy in, for example, producing a spreadsheet or a flowchart to take a decision like who should I marry or those sorts of questions. And I love the fact that you took it into the artistic realm, which for me opened up the whole possibility that, often when we make decisions, there isn't necessarily a simple solution to things. There's complexity there. There's nuance. There's the whole idea of perception. And so I love the idea of saying, actually, here's something that we like to think of in binary terms. And often questions that were asked come in binary terms, but actually this is way more complicated. And in the same way that a painting, we can see what's there at the end of it. But there's, as you say, there's a lot of thought process that's gone into how to represent these things. I love the idea of taking something that often feels binary and grappling with the complexity of it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I wanted to get at as well is you sort of mentioned it, the kind of all of this stuff is coloured by perception and, who the artist is and their viewpoint as much as anything else. And I think a lot of decision science or behavioral science literature, because it has this sort of rational economics context to it, it almost implies that there is this one way to do things and this one way to make the right decision and that everybody should be optimizing for the same thing. And I know that that's a bit of a straw man and not really what people think, but it is sometimes the message that's received and that comes off. And the thing I like about the idea of the decisionscape is that you're the artist, it's your canvas, it's your decision. And it's about whether you are arranging the things in the way that optimizes for what you want and need, not about whether you're putting them in the right place. So it's really that, everybody's individual version of this would look different, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I loved it because it gave me a freedom to recognize that actually, particularly where it isn't a binary decision and there are lots of potential, and I, increasingly as I get older, I'm seeing lots of things I have to decide on. I'm suddenly realizing there is a degree of complexity there that I probably, as I was younger, either conveniently ignored or just not been aware of. And so I love this idea of you opening it up and really pointing us towards that there isn't always one simple answer. As you say, there isn't one simple way of solving the problem. And so what I really liked was that it wasn't making the complexity a bug. The complexity is a feature. And we should just accept that in the same way that there isn't one way to make music or draw art.
I'm going to steal that. I love that. Yeah, the complexity is a feature, not a bug.
We're talking about cognitive load, and this is all a bit challenging and difficult and like we want to think as little as possible. But actually what I thought was lovely about it was there's a joy in decision making. And actually, we look at these things as a burden, but I thought the other thing the artistic framing gave us was an idea of thinking, actually, the fact that we are able to think and that we are able to manage this complex process, that's a privilege and a pleasure in some respects.
Totally. I mean, it's obvious I love decision making. I've written a whole book about it. So I think it's exactly right that it's joyous. And I imagine listeners of your podcast will agree. I think some of the bits that really got to that for me were the last section, I should say the way it's structured is it takes different aspects of this metaphorical comparison with how an artist creates their work. And the last section is called the frame. And it's the idea that an artist will partly deliberately choose what they're including. So where are they kind of, cutting off what's in and out of scope in the picture, what's the subject matter, who's the subject, etc. But there's also an aspect of it that's not deliberate. So they will be reflecting a cultural product. They'll be reflecting something that's interesting to people like them in their time and all of those things. And all of us, when we're looking at the world and making decisions, have these kind of invisible frames where often we're not aware of what we're excluding and how we're kind of bounding our choices. And so that section is really about what if we could blow up the frame a little bit? What if there was a kind of third way that wasn't, within the binary that you set yourself or whatever it might be. And I thought that was really interesting and kind of liberating to write because it felt quite hopeful, essentially the sort of headline I kind of go with on it is like, you've just got to remember all this shit is completely made up. Like we could just make it up differently if we wanted to.
Right. And I think the idea that there aren't any rules here, right, that actually often the decision-making that we have, to your point, is bounded by convention or what we see other people doing, and you go through all of these different features, but all of that is creating rules for us. And so I like this idea, again, back to the artistic thing of thinking, on the one hand, artists are free to do what the hell they want. On the other hand, they need constraints because otherwise you wouldn't have any, whether that constraint is the materials they use or the perspective they choose to put on it. If they didn't have those constraints in place, they'd never get their pieces of art completed. But I like this idea of actually we can open it up and just do what we want. And you were very good at pointing out some of the constraining factors that we might not think of. I thought, this is going to be a book that's going to help me to make better decisions. And actually, I just went, it hadn't even occurred to me that this was a factor in the way that I viewed the world. So the one example that really struck me was you were talking about, I'm going to get the wording wrong, but you were talking about, let's paraphrase it hugely, but sort of transgressing is a privilege. And the ability to be abnormal and weird and different is a privilege. And I'd never thought about that. Do you want to unpick that? Because I think that's helpful. But it's a really good illustration of a kind of mind-blowing insights I went through. I was like, oh man, I hadn't even been aware of that.
Yeah, thank you. Mind-blowing is exactly the kind of word you want to hear when you've written a book. So that's amazing. Yeah, this came from the sort of specific story that I attached to this one is I describe a piece of work I did in children's centres in the UK. So these children's centres, their kind of clientele is typically lower income families, mostly mums and their kids. And they're there to provide, all kinds of social support and connection and services. And there was a really interesting phenomenon when I was doing some of the field work in one of the poorest areas that we went and visited, where a lot of the mums were dressed in a way that was very similar to each other. Clearly it was a lot of sort of conspicuous consumption. So quite showy, lots of designer clothes. There were these prams that I was told cost, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was kind of over £1,000 to get one of these prams. Everybody looked absolutely immaculate. And yet, when you sort of talk to them and just the kind of pure facts of the economics of the area, they couldn't afford to eat. So they would go to the children's centre to get some free biscuits because they were choosing between feeding themselves and feeding their kids and various other things. And you look at this as someone that is looking through a kind of rational economic decision-making lens, maybe someone who's designing welfare policy, maybe someone who's writing for one of our less charitable newspapers, and you think, this is a really bad set of decisions. What are these people doing? It's very easy to judge. It's very easy to get very frustrated. But the thing that really kind of struck me about it is that what they were buying through this conspicuous consumption and through kind of presenting in this way was essentially social belonging and connection. And when you live in a really resource constrained environment, which a lot of people who are, not everybody, but a lot of people who make policy and make decisions for people in these circumstances, a lot of people don't have those resource constraints, so they really can't relate to it. But that means that social belonging and fitting in and being able to rely on other people and essentially social capital is much, much more valuable than it is if you have the means to basically buy yourself out of problems. So, it looks like a handbag from the outside, but it's actually an investment in social capital, an investment in fitting in. It's an investment in being able to call somebody up when you really need them, having trust, having people believe that you're going to stick with them, all of those kinds of things. And I just thought it was really, really fascinating. And we actually ended up running an experiment so that a lot of these children's centres run numeracy and literacy classes that the parents that attend the children's centre can go to. And we ended up running this experiment where we tried to improve attendance rates at those by pairing people up with a buddy. So it wasn't, quite as explicit as let's exploit this need for social belonging and this need for not letting each other down. But it was this recognition that social incentives might be more powerful in a lot of ways than, do it because you want to get the maths qualification. And it turned out that it was really, really effective. So you got a bonus if you attended a certain number of classes, 80% of the classes. And if you had a buddy, the pair of you were much more likely to end up getting the bonus. About 75% of the time, the people with a buddy got the bonus. And it was 43% of the time for the people who didn't have an accountability buddy.
And so what I find interesting there is that you've approached, there's two things going on here. One is the frame and the approach that government might traditionally adopt to solve these problems would look at what the decision making of the individuals whose lives they're trying to improve through a lens that's not appropriate, through a frame that's not appropriate. But in order to be able to get them to help themselves, you have to question your own way of thinking, but you also have to understand what's going on in their minds. And so the evidence, the approach that we might think would work won't necessarily, because we haven't understood the basis on which they're making decisions. And so I think that's where the idea of looking at it as a picture or a sort of creative way gives you a sense that we might have to explore unorthodox approaches here. And so if we approach everything through a logical lens, what we might term the economic lens, we're going to get to wrong answers. And so the sort of artistic perspective on things allows us to start thinking, well, maybe they've been, from our perspective, the way they look at the world may feel very odd and different, but it's just a different form of creativity. And so I love this idea of that's how we get permission to think differently and think in an unorthodox manner, because art and creativity is the space where people are able to think freely. And so when we're trying to solve problems with a logical lens, we often don't permit ourselves to do that. And what I thought you were doing, and that's a really good example of saying, actually, I need to be free to think that other people may perceive things completely differently. And I can do that much more easily, I think, through an artistic lens than a logical lens.
Yeah, and I think there's a version where you can still apply the logical lens to an example like the one I just gave, which is you could say, okay, fine, well, I've just misunderstood. If I'm taking an economic lens on it, you could just say, well, I've misunderstood in that situation what utility is. So, like, if I'm doing a cost-benefit analysis, I thought it was about a direct route to how do you minimize your costs so that you can afford the things that you need. And I hadn't understood that there's also utility assigned to social capital and that therefore investing in social capital is a smart thing to do. And you could say, I can come up with a perfectly rational model as to exactly why dressing your child in the Hugo Boss is the right thing to do in this situation. But I think the thing but I do agree with what you're saying. And I think there are parts of the book that the sort of journey I went on writing them really made me reject essentially what I've just said, that kind of where you can actually apply an economic frame to everything because you just need to recategorize how you kind of generate the costs and benefits. And one of the particular bits was around, there's a section on composition. So again, this is a section of the book where I pick this metaphor, this part of the metaphor to explore. So in this case, it's that when an artist is composing a picture, you'll often find there are even particular styles of art that essentially trade on this, but the whole and the parts can be quite different to each other. So you can sort of stand back and look at something by an impressionist, for example, and you can see what it is. But if you go and look at any of the specific details up close, it's all kind of blotted, thick brush strokes, and you can't really kind of make it out. And when I was writing that bit, I found all of these examples of where people as a collective behave, or the sort of expression of their individual behaviors doesn't really, it's not the sort of laddering up of what all the individuals are doing. And so the group and the individual end up quite different, looking quite different to each other. And that to me does just defy that sort of collective behavior thing, does kind of defy this sort of economic framework in a slightly more kind of convincing way. I think it's much harder to kind of figure out how all those different things are going to interact. It's tempting to think that you could make a model that's got, multiplicative effects in it and all of that stuff. But I just think there's something that you're never going to capture, something that's a little bit magic about the way that people behave collectively, the way that their individual decisions, their slightly differing perspectives all kind of merge and create something different and often better than their individual pieces.
You gave the example of a crowd singing Bohemian Rhapsody, and I love this idea that individuals singing it probably don't sound great because it's quite difficult to the extent that we can call it a song. I question whether that's an appropriate word, but I love this idea, if you talked about it, that individuals probably didn't sound great, but collectively it sounded amazing.
Yeah, I got really obsessed with this, not least because this is like, so I don't think I'm unusual in this, but it is quite a weird thing to do where I have a couple of videos where if I just need a little strategic weep to just, just release some emotion, I'll just go and watch that. And the crowd singing Bohemian Rhapsody in Hyde Park, they're waiting for Green Day to come on stage and the tannoy is playing this horrible kind of tinny version of Bohemian Rhapsody. And the crowd just takes over. And it is one of the most magnificent, beautiful things that you'll ever see on the internet. So I got quite into it. And the reason it works so well is sort of to do with diversity, really. So it's that you have a very small number of people in the crowd who are amazing singers. So individually, they could probably bash out the whole of Bohemian Rhapsody on time, on key, note for note perfect. There's not going to be many of them, but they'll be dotted sort of throughout the crowd. And so they're going to kind of anchor people at least to the beat and keep them on time. And then, because they drown out the tannoy really quickly, right? So you're not actually getting any kind of, there's no conductor at the front or no real music to listen to. And then you've got a bunch of people who are probably like mediocre or even quite good singers, but Bohemian Rhapsody's a hard song. So the bits within their range, they can nail. And they're good enough to know that maybe they bail out on the bits that they can't. And because people are different, their ranges will all cover different sections of it. So you've essentially got the whole song covered by at least, some fraction of the crowd. And then you've got all the people that are going to ruin it for everybody by getting it wrong because they're horrible singers or they're overconfident or they're drunk or, whatever it might be.
I feel seen at this point.
Yeah, me too, don't worry. And you think, you can't expect them not to join in. It's this great moment of kind of collective bonding. But obviously they're going to ruin it. But they don't ruin it because the great thing about a song like Bohemian Rhapsody is there's only one very, very precise way to be right. And there are absolutely loads of ways to be wrong. And people are wrong in all sorts of different ways. They're not collectively and coherently and consistently wrong. And so what they end up doing is they actually just create this like really nice kind of hum of noise that sort of swells the whole thing up and makes it sound really atmospheric. And so collectively, the good singers, the mediocre singers and the bad singers all bring a contribution to making the crowd singing Bohemian Rhapsody sound perfect.
It's a lovely example of the eclectic nature of the stories that you tell. And I wonder, you've given a couple of examples and as you've gone back in time to look at older art, you've talked about stories that reference yourself, things that are important to you, range of different cultural influence. How did you pick the stories you get in there? Because I could imagine that you've got a ton to choose from, given the subject matter. There's lots of things you could have chosen. How did you pick the ones that you put in there?
Yeah, look, the first thing about a book is that you do have 18,000 words you have to write. So the great sort of pleasure and privilege of it is that you don't have to make that many choices about what to edit out. Because yes, you have a lot of things you could say, but you've got to say a lot of things in a book. So it's really good. It was, but there were a few things that didn't make the cut. I actually had a whole section on the post office scandal. And I thought, no, I'm not going to put that in. It's a bit niche and boring. And then during the time that the book was in production, the Post Office Scandal TV show came out and it turned into kind of like the biggest public interest story in the UK. And I thought, oh, that's annoying. But I think a lot of it was that I had, the way that I kind of write and the way that I think is that I tend to spend a little bit of time, I think a lot of people do this, but spend a little bit of time not really thinking about an idea, having it in the back of my head, but doing some sort of like non-conscious pattern recognition exercise where, I'll be listening to a podcast on like, I don't know, 11th century monasteries or something. And I'll think, God, that's really interesting. That's exactly like this thing I was reading on celebrity culture. And, I don't know, I'm just making it up. But I think that there were a lot of moments when I was writing the book where that was happening. So actually, even the central metaphor, I've sort of talked about it as relating to art, but in particular, it relates to the sort of use of linear perspective. Well, the first bit of the book is about linear perspective. So the illusion of depth in art and how how our brains do something similar to that when we're dealing with psychological distance. And that was something that came in really, really late. So I was walking probably on one of the endless can I get her to nap walks with the pushchair, and I was listening to this podcast about the history of art and the sort of like surprisingly epic journey of how long it took us and how hard it was to figure out how to do linear perspective. And it all just sort of clicked in, and I thought, that's exactly what I've been looking for. That's a really great way of articulating what I'm trying to say about our brains and about psychology, but using this sort of real world example of a massive cultural innovation that completely transformed the way that we represent the world and the way that we kind of perceive and see it.
And I think that's a really good illustration of one of the things I really took away from the book was our desire to make sense of things means that we pull from whatever from the, and this is a commonly known, we use the information that we have available to us as opposed to the information that we should use from a logical perspective. And so that can mean that we'll take inspiration from all sorts of different sources. And I thought it was really interesting as I reflected back to the sort of the overall analysis of this as an artistic process, as opposed to a logical one, was that the sources and influences that we use can be, and this is why we can come to the same conclusion using different evidence, but we could look at the same thing with different, because we've got that different hinterland, we've got different influences on it. And so I love this idea of actually we're making sense of the world and we're taking inspiration from all sorts of different sources. So I might have listened to a load of things that you've never heard of that I will draw a connection to. And I think that's a great example that you've just illustrated there of the ingenuity, if you like, of the human brain to take data that's available to us and experiences that are available to us and turn that into something relevant that might not seem it to anybody else. But this idea of curating what information we have into a way that makes sense and then a decision. And I think that's, again, where the artistic bit works really well, because there are no rules about where artists get their information from, in the same way that we can all find ways to use the information that we have to input the decisions that we make.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's an amazing articulation of it. I completely agree.
When you were scoping out the book, when you started, was the direction clear to you, or were you discovering as you were writing? In other words, did the metaphor shift, or had you got that framed up front, pun intended?
I think very good. I think so the metaphor did shift. So I was originally working with this physics metaphor of like the Lagrange equation. So the closer you are to something, the harder it is to move it. And I stuck with that for quite a while. And the reason I sort of stuck with it until it broke, basically. But I also thought the book was only going to be about psychological distance, say about how, and by psychological distance, I just mean that when you're making a decision, some of the things that you're factoring in are really proximal. So maybe the consequences affect somebody who's socially close to you, or you're going to feel the feedback immediately, like right now in the near term, or there's no kind of, you're not making a decision where there are like low odds that the outcome you want is actually going to happen. It's pretty much a dead cert. And all those things create this idea of sort of psychological proximity. And then at the other end of that, you have things that, happen far away to someone you don't know in the future with a low probability, etc. And those things are psychologically distant. And we, for good reasons, treat factors that are psychologically proximal and psychologically distant very differently. But we trip up in all kinds of very predictable ways and basically over discount and over minimize things that are psychologically distant and overweight and allow our decisions to be distorted by things that are psychologically proximal. So I thought that the book was only going to be about that. And in the end, that wound up just being the sort of first fifth of it, really, I guess. I sort of realized that I was just making the same point over and over again. And that was when I needed to kind of change the organizing metaphor, and when eventually the kind of arts version of things came in. And it was one of those slightly stressful. I don't think I could have tolerated the stress of knowing that I was just kind of feeling my way through it and figuring out stuff as it came. So I needed the illusion and pretense that I had a plan and was sticking to it. But if I look back in hindsight, a lot of the things where I wanted to try and find somewhere to include a particular example or story and was struggling to do that, once I got the art metaphor, it all fell into place, and it turned out that there was a coherence, and I just hadn't been able to see it. So it was nice to, I'm glad I landed on that, because there could have been a moment where I thought, oh God, I've got all the words and no organising framework.
It struck me as you were just talking, that's almost equivalent of the first draft that we know isn't going to be perfect. We're going to need to work it. So we need to crack on. We need something to get us started. And so I love this idea. If you start down a particular route and where you've ended up required that first bit to happen, right? You probably wouldn't have got to where you got to if you hadn't gone down that particular route. So I love this, that depiction of the artistic process in writing the book, which again sits alongside it, which is we've got to start somewhere, because you could sit there staring at the blank piece of paper for ages, but you need to put the pen or the paint on, or the brush on the paper for that to start. And so I love this idea of you start exploring something that becomes relevant. And so it's in a way, or it's a much bigger canvas than the one you started.
Yeah, I think, and some of it was like, you stand back, you look at what you've done, and you can see a sort of blurry version of what it's going to eventually be. It's just needs the detail added. And some of it there were moments where I was like, stood back, looked at it, I'm like, yeah, blurry, but I can see it's a picture of a dog. Like, that's what we're going to go with. And then I'd move that place and start working on it again, step back and be like, why is it now a fruit bowl? So it's like, there were some things where the entire direction changed, and I probably did need to just go get a new bit of canvas to overextend the metaphor. But I think all of it, just the practice of writing and the practice of, I personally I don't think I can fully think through an idea and figure out whether it's actually good enough to make the cut without writing it. You need to do the kind of really low level. If you can't explain it at the level of detail a sentence requires, then it's probably not well enough fleshed out.
How has the process of writing the book and the reception to it, I guess, and all the little things that have happened to you, how's that impacted your decision making?
I think so. I have this. Someone said to me when I first started working in the behavioural science field, they said, "You show me a psychology department and what people study, and I'll tell you what their neuroses are." And no offense to psychologists, but you do find a lot of people that are, forensically interested in a particular aspect of psychology. It's because they're not particularly great at that thing, or because it poses a problem to them, or it's something that, looms large for them. And I think I really oscillate on decision making between, there have been times in my life where I've thought of myself as a really good, decisive decision maker. I'm like, I take complex information, I synthesize it, I make a really strong, clear decision quickly. I like move countries at the drop of a hat. Whatever it might be. And then there are times when I think, oh my God, I have no idea what I'm doing. What have I done here? I've like completely made a total Frankenstein's monster of a decision where I've taken all of these inputs and mangled them into something that makes absolutely no sense. So I am slightly loath to say, yes, it's improved and changed my decision making, because I'll sort of come to regret that. And B, I just think it's quite funny that a lot of the time when people are writing these books, it's through a slightly hypocritical and kind of slightly hypocritical lens. I don't know how to do this either, but let me tell you.
But I love that idea of it links back to the artistic thing. I love this idea of we're never going to be 100% brilliant. We are going to screw stuff up, right? It doesn't matter how well practiced, rehearsed you are in decision making.
Yeah.
There are going to be piss poor decisions that at some point you make for whatever reason. And so we could look at that a little bit like, if we thought about music, not every single track is going to be a hit single. There's going to be some dreadful stuff, and we can, you can pick your sort of You pick your artist. But if I look at some of Paul McCartney's output, it's not all fabulously amazing, right? And that's the stuff that he recorded, let alone the stuff that never made it onto the vinyl or onto the
Yeah.
onto the recording studio. There's a load of crap there, and so it's back to almost the challenge of conventional economics, where everything has to be rational and logical, and so we are going to screw decision making up. And so for me, the artistic metaphor worked as well, because not every piece of art is going to be good. There is going to be some crap that we do, and we have to live with that. And so as I was as I was reading it, I was sort of thinking, well, I'm never going to get everything right. So my objective here isn't to nail decision making, be brilliant, because that would be inhumane. Actually, I want to screw some stuff up and have some serendipitous moments that come from a really piss poor decision. Equally, I'd rather, some of them are terrible and I'm living with the consequences now, but I like that idea as well, that actually, if we treat this as more of an art, then we have to recognize that we're going to screw some things up, and we should just accept that that's going to happen. What we're trying to do here is, it seemed to me, was to be broad, understand how the process works, and try and be better more often than not, but recognize that we are still going to screw some things up.
Yeah, and I think there's something about, I'm realizing I probably could have articulated this better in the book itself, so I'll have a crack at it now. I think there's something about what kind of decision is it and what are the stakes, that this is obvious, but that's really, really important. But sometimes it's hard to kind of tell, there are big decisions like, should I marry this person, or should I,
buying a house, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was going to say buying a house, and then I thought, well, even that, you can just sell the house, can't you? But, big, there are big decisions where clearly the stakes are high, and clearly you should be kind of, really thinking about, am I optimizing for the things that I want and care about? And it's easy to kind of pause and make sure that you're doing those things well. And I suppose the weird thing about those kinds of decisions is you often do them quite quickly, not because you're not thinking about them hard, but because it's not that challenging to do something where you're like, this is the sum of all the things that express who I am and what I want and what I value, because you do know those things when you really kind of think about it, and those decisions force you to sort of bring those into the fore. But I think there's a type of decision that we don't do well, where it's a bit of a, it's a bit of a slightly cheesy expression, but it's like the way you spend your days is the way you spend your life. And we really fail to recognize decisions like that, where we might be kind of chronically unhappy or chronically stuck in a pattern of frustration. And we constantly think, if only once I've got the kitchen done, that'll make things better. Or once I've, got that promotion, everything will improve. And you just end up on this sort of hedonic treadmill of all of that stuff. And I think we're not very good at recognizing that those small choices to persist and to continue on with things like that are actually really big choices that determine what you're going to be able to say at the end of your life. And so I think one of the things I really enjoyed looking into in the book is these different tools of how you can get perspective when you need it, and then how you can kind of get back in the game and forget all of that big picture stuff. So there's a particular concept called construal level, which is kind of linked to the psychological distance piece in the book. So one of the reasons that we find things that are psychologically distant so hard to actually factor in properly in our decisions is that they've got what we'd call a really high construal level. So they're very abstract. We don't tend to be kind of able to vividly imagine the detail of them. They don't evoke emotional responses in us. And then conversely, things that are psychologically proximal have a very low construal level. So they are super concrete. They're really tangible. We can immediately see what the implications are for us. And there are, various exercises you can do to try and dial up or dial down the level of construal. And sometimes it's really useful to do that. So one thing, I'm quite a big fan of the kind of 4,000 weeks frame. So the Oliver Burkeman book of like, you've got 4,000 weeks on this earth. What are you going to do with them? And it's big and it's scary, and you just would not be able to tolerate living your life if the entire time your eyes were on 4,000 weeks. How many have I had? How many have I done? But it's really useful every now and then to sort of zoom out and think about that. And the reason I think that works from a construal level perspective is that a week is a unit that is meaningful to us. So it's low construal level. We can actually grapple with it. And so the idea of 4,000 of them is like existentially horrifying, because it doesn't sounds like a big-ish number, but not that big. because we know how fast a week passes. Whereas if you talk in years, people are like, oh, a year's ages. I'm not worried about that. So anyway, I think there's a thing about what type of decision is it? Are you thinking in the right way about it? And are you giving yourself enough of a, like, if you do the zoom out exercise and you realize it's because you hate the job, and it's not that you would hate all jobs, it's this specific one. It's like, quit, go do something else. Don't sit there kind of whinging anymore. Just get on with it.
And I love that idea of the distinction between focusing on decisions in the wrong way potentially, and that lots of little decisions is a big decision. And so I was thinking as you were talking about things like habits, where buying a house feels like a big thing, getting married feels like a big thing because they are big things in the scheme of things. But actually, my decision about what I eat every single day, or the decision to go along with a particular process, or to work for an employer where you don't really buy into what they're doing. I love that idea because that takes us into the whole realm of habits and the decision making around habits. And I keep coming back to the frames of decisions, the way we think about things. This is a big, significant decision, but the process I'm going through on a big decision is the same as the process I'm going through on a small one. I'm just using different inputs, but I'm doing the same thing essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, my take, it's not a particularly novel one, but my take on anything to do with habits and the kind of, what you eat on a day-to-day basis is a really good example. It's incredibly hard to rewire the human and the behavior. So you should try and design a process, or design your life around it. Design your life in a way that gets you the outcome that you want, rather than trying to force yourself to be a different person. So, simplest example is don't have snacks in the house if you're a snacker, rather than thinking, God, I hope I can resist those snacks in the cupboards. Yeah, I think as well, there's something I'm a little bit obsessed with, which is people having the wrong counterfactual in their decisions. So often when you talk to somebody about something, again, if I go back to work, for example, people are always a bit annoyed at work, even if they really like their job. There's always something to gripe about, and it's a sort of acceptable domain of your life that you can gripe about. It's a bit harder to kind of gripe about your personal life or whatever it might be, slagging off your kids. But I think with work, the things people get cross about are often, it's because they feel so cross about them because there's an imagined alternative or counterfactual where there's a workplace that doesn't have those things. So people will be like, oh, it's so annoying, I have to do this process, or this person's really irritating, they never get back to me when I ask them to, whatever it is that kind of grinds your gears. And it can be quite liberating and make you feel quite a lot better to just think, okay, but if you went and got another job, is there really another job where you don't experience that specific type of frustration? And if the answer is yes, there is, go get that job. But the answer is no, it's quite good to just change the counterfactual so that you don't feel like there's this huge chasm between what could be and what is, because the what could be is non-existent. And you see this in decisions all the time, and much higher stakes decisions. I've got some stuff in the book about some work I did with adoption social workers who place kids with families for adoption. And it's something I really observed in them, that the counterfactual that they'll have when they're thinking about, is this family a good enough placement for this child? The counterfactual should be, compared to keeping this child in the foster care system, given that all of the adoptive families have been highly vetted and, are really great loving homes, then the comparison should be compared to the foster care system. But the comparison often ends up being compared to the ideal adoption placement that I've imagined in my mind for this child. And the ideal doesn't exist. It would be wonderful if it did exist, but it doesn't. And you can end up causing quite a lot of damage by delaying decisions just because they don't stack up to an imaginary counterfactual that will never exist.
So in other words, I could have made a better decision. There is a better decision available. And so if I looked at it from a career perspective, right, I could have chosen a job where this wasn't there, or I could go and pick one. And therefore I'm angry with myself and I'm angry with the situation. And so it's almost, it's like I could solve this problem if if I'd made a better call.
No, I think it's the opposite of that. I think it's that, I think it's that, so maybe that is true. Maybe there is a better call that you could have made, but in that case, you should just go and take that job instead. I think it's that people imagine there's a better job. So they imagine that there is a workplace where none of their colleagues are annoying, all of the processes are proportionate. They absolutely love having to do all of the email admin, whatever. So people get cross about these things where it's like, but that's not a unique problem to this job. That's just jobs.
That's just jobs, right?
Yeah. And like, you could have a radical response to that and say, well, I'm rejecting the entire world of work, and that's great. That's why if that's the kind of thing that you want for your life, then go figure out how to do it. But if you're going to sit and be expending lots of emotional energy all day while also still working in an office job, you can just let go of it by realizing that the counterfactual universe you think exists doesn't, and actually this is fine in the scheme of the available options.
And that's because that ties neatly into the idea of sort of making the best possible decision, where we approach things and there is a presumption that there is if I can get this right, then I'll pick the perfect thing and it'll work really, really well. But as often as and you've pointed out, and I think it's really prevalent in government, where lots of the things we look at as voters, we go, why don't they do this, right? And actually, there's a whole load of competing. There isn't a simple, ideal solution because, as ever with life, there are trade-offs and things that you're not aware of. And so, I often think when we make decisions, we sort of have this in the same way that I might go, "Oh, this job's awful," imagining the perfect job where none of these dynamics that naturally. We often think life is a lot easier than it is. And so, I think we beat. I don't know what you think, but I think we beat ourselves up with decision making, where it's like it's sort of as I'm taking the decision, sometimes I'm looking for that perfect solution without recognizing that trade-offs have to happen. And so that's where I like to get in your creative framing of thinking, well, if I can recognize that this is going to come with some elements of things that I'm going to regret, but what the hell, whichever option I choose is going to have that. And therefore it's a trade-off. It's not a perfectly clear the picture isn't always going to be perfectly clear, to continue the artistic metaphor.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like the sort of, the opportunity cost of, you can even look at it from a artistic perspective. Like if you've only got so much canvas space, if you decide you're going to draw this thing, that's space that you can't draw another thing in. I think there's also something else on decision making, which is one of the best things that people can do for themselves is figure out how to satisfy. So how to, figure out what good enough looks like and then just solve for that. Because a lot of people really overthink their decisions and try and kind of optimize for absolutely everything. And most decisions really don't require you to do that. Most decisions, the stakes aren't high enough that you need perfect. As long as you've got good enough, then that's absolutely fine. And knowing when to satisfy and when to really kind of like optimize and pay attention matters a lot. Although that said, I was talking to somebody who's a real kind of optimizer about this, and they were saying that there are certain decisions that they try and be quite deliberate about this, so that they're not obsessing over perfection every time. But there are certain decisions which are absolutely satisfying decisions. So good enough would be acceptable. So maybe you're like buying a new blender or something, and they were saying that they get great personal satisfaction from spending hours researching blenders and figuring out exactly what the right one is. I was thinking, this is the most alien thing I've ever heard. I couldn't give a shit what my blender's like, as long as it, whizzes up the fruit fine. But I thought that was a really interesting example of how, your Decisionscape and my Decisionscape are not optimized for the same thing, so they'll look very different.
Right. Well, I've got the worst of all worlds, though, because thinking about that is I will do bugger all research beforehand, go out exactly along the lines you described. It doesn't really matter, right? And then I'll go read the reviews that I should have read beforehand, right? So it's almost like I'm going through the effort, but I get none of the benefit of the effort, except obviously focusing heavily on the reviews that confirmation bias kicking in, right? I'm looking for those reviews that confirm I've made a good call.
I thought you were going to say that you were like shopping for regret. You were like, you know what I'd love to do? Just regret this decision. Let me go look at the 1-star reviews and figure out what chump I am.
Just deliberately go out and buy the worst possible, right? Knowing that I'm going to be incredibly critical, go out and buy the worst possible thing. That's fine. I love that idea. Let's give that a go with something ridiculously cheap. I'm not going to do it with expensive stuff. But I think the way you've just talked about that, right? It does illustrate that if the word decision, and I think if I think about sort of popular culture, quiz shows where you've got to choose A, or Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, right? Choose one of these options. And there's always jeopardy attached to it. And what I like about the way you've just articulated, it can be fun. And we can embrace this thing and just go, I'm going to screw some things up. I'll try not to screw up the major things. And just almost play with it and enjoy the fact that we have that capability. And so I like the sense of humor that you've just brought to that blender decision. I think there is a way of looking at life and making it much more enjoyable and not taking things too seriously, recognizing the complexities of what's going on in our head and the fact that, to your point, we're not going to get everything right.
Yeah, I think the game show thing's a really good metaphor as well, because I have this sense that people, um, maybe this is just like all the nerds that I know, but I think people, it's very, very hard to remember that when you're making a choice about most things, there's no like right answer. So it's not like, when you're doing the puzzle book and then you're the crossword in the newspaper and then you can turn it upside down and look at the right answers written upside down on the bottom of the page. Like, I cannot shake this
Yeah.
idea of the time that someone's there with the answers written down. I just need to turn the page upside down, or I can check afterwards and see if I got it right. And a lot of the work that I do in my job is, we're working on really complex kind of social phenomena and trying to unpick incredibly entrenched, difficult, almost wicked problems. And one of the biggest barriers to doing that kind of work, I think, is that a lot of the people that work on those problems have been trained in environments where there's a right answer and you're going to be marked against it. And it's embarrassing if you're wrong. And it's a hard mindset to get out.
Right. So it's a maths problem, basically. Right.
Yeah. And it's a really hard mindset to get out of. And there's all kinds of dimensions to it. But you are just constantly sitting there thinking, I wonder if this is the right answer. And then you think, oh shit, there isn't a right answer. Like nobody's got the question key at the end. Like we're not going to know. It's just going to play out. And again, that can be quite liberating to think nobody's going to tell you it was wrong, but also it can be horrifying because you'll never know if you could have done better.
I was musing about that. I was putting a piece of IKEA furniture together the other day, and I was thinking about IKEA versus Lego. And Lego, they give you a few spare parts, right? Because there's particularly the small pieces that you might. So when you finish the Lego model, there will be a few little bits left over, and of course that hides the fact that sometimes you've got extra bits left over that you probably should have incorporated somewhere in the model. But it doesn't matter, right? It still looks okay. Whereas IKEA, they don't give you a single spare part.
IKEA, when you've got a bit at the end, you think.
Yeah. And I sort of was just embracing Lego logic. I thought, well, if I convince myself that actually providing the thing doesn't wobble and it looks like it's working right, I'm assuming that I'll get away with it. And so I just sort of thought, well, I'll just deploy a bit of Lego logic for the IKEA model and pretend this is a spare part they've given me for CPU. And to your point, it's incredibly liberating because otherwise you sit there and go, I'm going to have to dismantle this whole bloody thing. And of course, dismantling it is not necessarily a smart decision because I've wedged bits in that possibly don't belong. And I'm not even sure that if I did dismantle, I'd get it right a second time because I clearly got it wrong the first time. So who's to say that I'm going to get it right the second time? And I thought actually, to back to your point, is like if you view this artist, so the Lego one, it's like, does it look okay? Or does it particularly if it's something you're just going to look at as opposed to play with? But even if you're playing with it, well, what the hell? It doesn't matter. There is no answer, and that's where I think the artistic bit is a really helpful frame to relax a bit about it and just say, of course, I don't want a set of shelves to come crashing on my head as I walk into the kitchen and a load of pots and pans fall on me. That's suboptimal. But actually, if the thing roughly works, that's fine.
Yeah, there is a good kind of artistic parallel with that, isn't there? Which is the best artists can kind of reduce something down to, so there's those Picasso pictures that are, sort of 2 or 3 black lines and it's the essence of a cow. And you look at it and you're like, that is incredible. Like, that's a cow. How is that, how is that possible? And so it's the essence, not the function, I suppose. It does work. I like that a lot.
Love it. The book's obviously just come out. Clearly comes highly recommended. What's next for you? I mean, you do fascinating work as you've outlined. Is there another book? When I know, having written one myself, is like you get to the point you go, I'm never doing that again. And of course, we know this, and you've done one as well. Obviously, you've written one with Michael previously, so you've got experience. Put a link to that in the show notes. But is there another book itching to come out? Are you taking a break? Where's your brain heading in that sense?
I think my brain is still quite burned out from this one. I'm not enthused to jump into writing a new book territory just yet, but I am starting every now and then to have kind of be an interesting, but it would be kind of conversations with myself. So I'm beginning to come out of the hibernation a bit, I think.
And the bit I love about that is there's a sense of you can try and shut it off, but your subconscious will be processing this stuff. And so I think, again, back to the creative thing, it's gonna pop out at some point, probably when you least want it to, but nonetheless. But I hope, but from my perspective, I hope that something more does come, because I think one of the bits that I loved is the book is written, I think, from a position of curiosity. And if I come back to your social media feed that I find really engaging, is you strike me as being someone that sort of just muses on things, and you know, if something strikes you, you kind of go for it and investigate and want to know more. And that sense of curiosity is it's going to be addictive, actually, I find. But also it's quite, as I see it in other people, it's very compelling. And so I love the way that you've approached this, almost with and maybe being a mother has helped on this one, but almost with a small child's eyes. It struck me as that you were going on an adventure to kind of learn more about this and make sense of the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really great description of it, actually. It's kind of funny because this is one of those sort of, I don't know if you would call it a personality trait or like a predisposition or whatever it might be, where I feel very, very lucky to do the kind of work that I do and to be in environments where people appreciate that and not only tolerate it, but it's considered to be a positive thing. Because I quite often think, if I worked in a supermarket and had to stack shelves or something and I kept getting distracted by, I've suddenly had an overwhelmingly important thought about whether ChatGPT thinks that all dogs are boys and all cats are girls, I need to go and test it immediately. I'd be fired on the spot. Like it just wouldn't, it wouldn't work at all. So I'm very aware that I'm extremely lucky that I've fallen into situations in my life where that's been appreciated and rewarded, when it could be a real kind of deficit and something that doesn't serve me well at all. And don't get me wrong, there are many situations where it doesn't serve me terribly well because I get distracted by the wrong things and pay attention to stuff that is not important. There were a lot of moments when on the maternity leave, when I was writing the book, where my daughter would be wearing a nappy on her head because I'd forgotten a sun hat, for example. But, swings and roundabouts.
I absolutely love, what a fabulous image on which to finish the show. Remind us what the book is called. And I always say where you can get it, but that's blindingly obvious. But remind people what the book is called.
It's called Decisionscape, and you can get it in all bookshops. I was going to say all good bookshops. I'm not putting value judgments on it. It's all bookshops.
Who cares? Just buy it is my simple advice. Thank you so much. One, for just entertaining me on social media, but secondly for writing what I think is a fabulous read that's really not just helpful in terms of how we make decisions, but has opened my eyes, as that privilege example illustrates, opened my eyes in all sorts of different ways. It's one I'm going to be going back to read again, because some of the things that you unleashed into my subconscious are still working their way through. So highly, highly recommended. But above all, thank you for being a fabulous guest on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's been amazing.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Elspeth for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Elspeth, to see some of the social media content that I referenced that I absolutely love, and to discover more about her book, Decisionscapes, and some of the work that she's doing, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If you've missed any of the previous episodes of the show where I talked about decision making, in particular the recent episodes featuring Dr. Melina Moleskis and Ben Catania, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there as well. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed in the past, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review for it, on whichever platform you're listening on, please do so. It really, really does help. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, enjoy exploring your Decisionscape, and thank you so much for listening.